Peter lived in a small village where everyone worked the land to survive. He wasn't a wealthy man, nor did he own large plots of land, but he had something that set him apart from the others: an unshakable faith in God. One day, while walking through his modest field, dry and cracked from lack of rain, he felt a divine calling in his heart. He knelt, closed his eyes, and prayed fervently, "Lord, guide me on this uncertain path. I know you will provide." The next day, Peter took his tools and began to build a barn. He had no harvest, no seeds, not even enough food to make it through the winter. But he built with the certainty that God had a purpose for him. The neighbors looked at him with disbelief and mocked him. "Peter has lost his mind," they said, laughing. "Why are you building a barn if you have nothing to store?" Others asked with disdain. But Peter didn't stop. Despite the hunger and exhaustion, he kept hammering, placing boards, and raising the walls of his future barn. Day after day, his faith kept him strong, even though inside, he struggled with doubt and fear. When he finally finished the construction, he stood in front of the empty structure and asked quietly, "Lord, what is your plan?" It was then that the unexpected happened. That night, while Peter slept, a fierce storm hit the village. The wind howled, the thunder shook the sky, and the rain fell with an intensity that hadn't been seen in years. The dry fields eagerly absorbed the water, and the rivers, which had been almost dry, began to fill again. The next morning, the villagers left their homes to assess the damage. Many of their crops had been swept away by the current, and some of their barns, weakened by time, had collapsed. However, Peter's barn remained intact, strong and imposing amid the mud and desolation. The neighbors looked at it in astonishment. "How is this possible?" they murmured. Peter, not fully understanding what was happening, went out to inspect the surroundings. It was then that he discovered something surprising. The river's current had carried piles of wheat and corn from distant lands, depositing them right at the doors of his barn. He knelt and, with tears in his eyes, raised his hands to the sky. "Thank you, Lord. I knew you would provide." The villagers, who had once mocked him, now looked at him with respect and awe. The rumor of Peter's miracle spread throughout the village. Some said it was just a coincidence, but others began to wonder if Peter's faith had truly moved God's hand. With humility, Peter opened his barn and called his neighbors. "God has blessed me, and this blessing is not just for me. If anyone is hungry, come and take what you need." The villagers, who had once ridiculed him, now approached with shame on their faces. Families who had lost their crops found refuge from hunger in Peter's barn. "Forgive us, Peter," said an elder from the village. "We laughed at you without knowing that God was working through your faith." Peter smiled kindly. "Faith is not about seeing to believe, but believing even when you cannot see." The villagers began working together to distribute food and replant the fields with new seeds. For the first time in a long while, the community united with a greater purpose. And as Peter watched his barn full of provisions, he realized that God had not only given him food, but also the opportunity to change hearts. Days passed, and the village, once divided by mistrust and competition, began to transform. Inspired by Peter's example, the villagers stopped thinking only of themselves and began helping each other. The men reinforced the damaged barns, the women prepared food to share with the most needy, and the children, once indifferent, listened attentively when Peter spoke about faith. One afternoon, a young man named Thomas approached Peter while he worked in his field. "Peter," he said timidly, "I always thought believing in God was a waste of time, but what happened with you has made me doubt my own beliefs." Peter set down his tools and looked at the young man with a smile. "Doubting is not bad, Thomas. Faith is not something imposed. but something discovered along the way. "And how can I discover it?" asked the young man. Peter looked up at the sky and then pointed to the fertile land that had come to life after the storm. "Listen to your heart. Observe what God has done here, and ask yourself if all of this could have happened by chance." Thomas nodded thoughtfully, and from that day on, he began seeking answers in prayer and in the kindness he saw flourishing in the village. What started as the act of one man slowly became a wave of change that touched everyone. Time passed, and the village, once struck by drought and despair, became a prosperous and united place. Thanks to the unexpected provision and collective effort, no one went hungry again. Peter, however, did not take credit for it. Every time someone called him wise or blessed, he responded humbly, "It's not me, but God who has worked. I just had faith and obeyed." But not everyone in the village was convinced. A man named Stephen, one of the most skeptical, still insisted that it had all been a coincidence. "I don't deny that Peter has been generous," he said one afternoon while discussing with other villagers. "But this wasn't a miracle. The storm brought the grains by chance. If God had really intervened, he would have made it rain before Peter finished his barn, not after." The villagers fell silent, unsure of what to say. But Peter, who had overheard the conversation, calmly approached. "Stephen, tell me something," he said in a serene voice. "Do you think the wind blows without purpose?" The man frowned. "The wind is just wind. It goes where it wants." Peter smiled. "That's how faith is. We don't always see its purpose immediately, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have one." Stephen didn't respond, but the shadow of doubt appeared on his face. Although he still didn't admit it, something inside him had begun to change. The days went on, and although Stephen tried to convince himself that it had all been a coincidence, he couldn't ignore what he saw around him. The village was thriving like never before, and all thanks to a man who had believed when no one else did. One afternoon, while Peter was checking the grain reserves in his barn, Stephen approached silently. He looked at the huge piles of wheat and corn and sighed. "Maybe I've been a fool," he said finally. "I've seen how everything has changed since you decided to trust in God." Peter turned and looked at him with understanding. "It's not easy to believe when everything seems lost," he replied. "I had doubts myself while I was building this barn. But faith doesn't mean having no doubts. It means moving forward despite them." Stephen nodded slowly. "And what if I'm wrong? What if I try to believe, but nothing happens?" Peter placed a hand on his shoulder. "Faith isn't a deal with God. It's not about doing something to get something in return. It's trusting that, no matter what happens, he has a greater purpose." Peter's words sank deep into Stephen's heart. He didn't respond immediately, but something inside him began to soften. That night, for the first time in his life, Stephen looked up at the sky and whispered a prayer. The dawn brought a new peace for Stephen. He couldn't explain it, but he felt that something inside him had changed. That day, he worked on his land with a different attitude, observing nature with new eyes, wondering if God had always been there, waiting for him to recognize him. Meanwhile, the village continued to flourish. The rains returned on time, the crops grew abundantly, and the people no longer lived in fear of scarcity. It had all begun with the faith of one man, but now the whole community had been transformed. One afternoon, Stephen arrived at Peter's house with a bag of seeds in his hand. "I want to plant a new field," he said firmly. "Not because I'm sure of what will happen, but because I want to learn to trust." Peter smiled with joy. "That's the first step, my friend. Faith is planted like a seed and grows over time." Together, they went to the field and began to prepare the land. Stephen, who had once been the most skeptical, was now digging with hope. The villagers watched the scene with admiration. They had witnessed the power of faith in Peter, but seeing Stephen change his heart was proof that God was still working among them. And so, Peter's lesson not only fed the village with grains, but also with a faith that would endure for generations. Over time, the village ceased to be a place marked by scarcity and despair. It became a prosperous town where generosity and faith guided its inhabitants. Peter's story became a testimony that was passed down from generation to generation, inspiring others to trust in God even in the most difficult times. One day, a traveler arrived in the village and was amazed by the abundance and harmony of the place. He approached Peter, now an older man, and asked, "What's the secret of this village? How did you manage to escape misery and achieve such prosperity?" Peter smiled, looking at the barn full of provisions and the golden fields of harvest. Then he pointed to his heart and said, "The secret is not in the land or the rain. It's in faith. When you trust in God, even when everything seems lost, He makes paths where before there was only desert." The traveler nodded, reflecting on those words. Meanwhile, Stephen, now a man of deep faith, taught the young people of the village about the importance of trusting in God. He, who had once been the most skeptical, was now a living testimony of the power of faith and transformation. Thus, Peter's story not only changed his own life, but illuminated the path for an entire community. His barn was much more than a grain storage. It was a symbol of trust in the impossible, of hope in the midst of adversity, and the certainty that God always provides in His perfect timing.